We're diving in and continuing forward today in this sermon series on the book of James. And we called this series All Day, Every Day. And today we're continuing forward. We're moving forward in James through chapter 2. And today we're talking about James 2, verses 14 through 26. If you didn't bring a Bible, raise your hand. The ushers would love to bring you one. This is a great time to turn to James 2 in your Bible, and you can kind of mark it there because we're going to keep going through that today. And this is a powerful passage. There's lots for us to talk about, but before we dive in, I kind of have a fun story connection that I wanted to share. It might even be borderline selfish to share it, but it's cool. I think it's fun. I have been fortunate to be on the team here at Ransom for a little over 8 years, which is awesome. But before that, my wife and I, as just people new to town, were just looking for a church to attend. And so on a recommendation, we made our way into this building a little over 10 years ago, late spring of 2014. And it was maybe the second or maybe the third time, we can't quite figure out, second or third time that we were here. We were sitting right back over in that corner over there, and we heard Pastor Phil preach a sermon in a series on the book of James, on James 2, verses 14 through 26. And so 10 years later, I'm finding it very cool that I get to be up here talking about James 2, 14 through 26. So somebody right back over there, mark your calendars for 2034. You're going to be up next. Now, I was tempted not to share that at all because then I could have just, copied and pasted Phil's message and you probably wouldn't have even noticed. But we are going to take it a slightly different direction. So I promise there's no plagiarism today. These few verses in James are as powerful and honestly as controversial as just about any place in the entire Bible, certainly in the New Testament. And as we have been seeing week after week through this series, James just does not pull any punches. He continues to call us to a life of faith that is just uncompromising. And so to really get into it today, I think we just got to start with the word. We got to read the passage to get going. Now, I said I wouldn't plagiarize, but I didn't say anything about YouTube. So we are going to let young Pastor Phil read this for us this morning. Let's check that out.
So James chapter 2, starting with verse 14, page 736. Here we go. What good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say that you have faith, but you don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say goodbye and have a good day, stay warm and eat well, but then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do? So you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. Now, I want you to understand that you heard that correctly. He said faith by itself isn't enough.
The memories, huh? If you're brand new, Pastor Phil is still our lead pastor, but now he has these gorgeous flowing midlife crisis locks, and it's amazing. So, no, listen, but at the end of that clip, Pastor Phil was really acknowledging that the controversy, the big topic in this passage. James says multiple times in these few verses that faith without action is dead, useless. It's not enough. The language is even so forceful that it really kicks off a debate on salvation itself. How are we saved? Are we saved by faith? Are we saved by works, by actions? And this is exactly why the book of James gets a lot of attention, and honestly, not all of it positive. In fact, the great church father Martin Luther, the man who kicked off the Protestant Reformation, was so bothered by the way James talked about faith and works that he said he wished it was taken out of the Bible and thrown into the fire. And in a way, I kind of get where he's coming from. Here at Ransom, we have worked really, really hard over the years to make sure that you and I understand and accept that there is nothing we can do to earn God's love. Nothing we can do to earn grace and mercy and salvation, to earn our way into heaven. It doesn't matter how hard we try or how many good things we do, what our life has looked like. We can never, ever, ever earn what God offers to us through the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is a free gift. We didn't earn it, period. End of discussion. But what good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? It seems to me that James knew we would need a clear and compelling reminder of what Jesus actually calls us into. Now, if you have been with us through this series, this honestly isn't a new conversation. A couple weeks ago, we were looking at chapter 1, where it talks about listening to the word, but also doing it, not just listening. And Pastor Phil brought us to the conclusion that obedience is not optional when it comes to a life of following Jesus. And here again in chapter 2, James is just doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on that notion by saying that faith without some form of tangible evidence of life change is probably not faith at all. But even if there's some kind of faith there, it's dead and useless. It's not doing you or anyone else any good at all. So first, we got to just address the controversy head on. The big question is, does the Bible contradict itself, especially when it comes to this idea of salvation? Is there a contradiction here? The reason that's even a question is because in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, the Apostle Paul is writing, and he says this: God saved you by his grace when you believed, and you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we have done, so that no one can boast about it. But when we look in James 2, he says, so you see, we are shown to be right with God by what we do, not by faith alone. That sounds contradictory, right? Thankfully, if we take a closer look here, I think we can resolve that these thoughts are not actually at odds at all. In fact, they complement each other. See, Paul and James are writing these things. These are letters that they are writing. They're writing to real people, addressing real issues. Paul is writing his letter in Ephesians to address an incorrect and an unhealthy perspective that we can do these certain things to earn salvation, that we have to do these specific things in order for God to accept us. And Paul knows that Jesus' death on the cross absolutely demolishes that idea. So he writes his letter to say, hey, salvation is not a reward for good works. You didn't earn this whole thing. You can do all the right things, you can go through all the right motions, but if you don't have faith in who Jesus is and what he did for you, then all of that effort, all that action is dead and useless. James, on the other hand, is writing his letter to address an equally incorrect and unhealthy perspective that we can have a faith in Jesus that doesn't somehow change us, that doesn't move us to action, that is somehow only information or belief. James must be seeing or hearing about people that say that they're Christians and they're doing nothing, at least nothing of any good to the world around them. So he writes this letter to push back on that notion by saying, hey, faith without works is dead. You can say all the right things, but if your life isn't changing, whatever faith you claim to have is dead and useless. So here's what it boils down to. On the one hand, works without faith is dead. That's what Paul is saying in his letter. On the other hand, faith without works is also dead. That's what James is saying in his letter. And what Paul and James are both saying in their different ways from their different perspectives is that real faith in Jesus leads to something. Leads to something you can see. Their message together is that grace is unearned, but it changes us. And there will be evidence. Even if it's slow and imperfect, there will be evidence. The word that both of these guys use when they're talking about works or action or good deeds, the Greek word there is the word ergon. Ergon, the definition of that is an action that carries out an inner desire. And Paul is saying if our inner desire is driven by fear or legalism or pride or somehow earning salvation, then the good works, the ergon, whatever they are dead and useless. But if our inner desire stems from an understanding of grace and love of Jesus, then any action we take can become that ergon, that good work that James is encouraging us toward, whether it's something internal like choosing patience or offering forgiveness, or whether it's something external like generosity and kindness. Literally anything we do or say or decide can be ergon, can be a good work if it comes from that inner desire to love God and love others. James is not saying you need ergon, you need good works in order to be saved, but he's saying how can you be saved and not have ergon? How can you not act on that inner desire? So no, the Bible does not contradict itself when it comes to salvation, but I think God knew that we would need both of these reminders to help keep us in a healthy place in how we follow Jesus. Now, my goal for today is not to make you feel bad about yourself or question your salvation or carry this pressure to do a million things for Jesus. If you're feeling any of that, stick with me because we're going to keep moving in James 2, and I think there's actually something exciting here that we can lean into. So let's keep reading in James 2. We're going to jump ahead a little bit to the end of verse 20. Let's pick it up there. He says, "Can't you see that faith without good deeds is useless?" It's the point he's been making the whole time. He says, "Don't you remember that our ancestor Abraham was shown to be right with God by his actions when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see, his faith and his actions worked together. His actions made his faith complete. And so it happened just as the scriptures say. Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. He was even called the friend of God. So you see, we are shown to be right with God by what we do, not by faith alone." So James wants to keep reinforcing this point about faith and works and how this all plays out. So he picks out an example that we can read about in the Old Testament, the example of Abraham. And the story that he's referencing is wild. We don't have time for it all today. We've visited it recently in the last year, but essentially Abraham was prepared to be so obedient to God that he was ready to give up his precious son. And God ultimately stops him and saves Isaac, but this was proof of Abraham's full and complete trust in God. But as part of telling this story, James drops this one little notion in there that actually caught my attention for the first time reading this. The many times I've read this, I never caught this before. I don't know if you caught it. At the end of verse 23, he said that Abraham, whose faith and actions worked together, was even called the friend of God. A friend of God. James mentions this incredible story from somebody who is absolutely on the Mount Rushmore of faith and says this guy was so unique that he was even called a friend of God. I don't know about you, but I would like to be called the friend of God. If that's a special designation, I would love to be a friend of God. If you read up on Abraham in Genesis, he is far from perfect, but he has a deep and dynamic relationship with God. It has back and forth. Abraham enjoyed God's blessing. God talked to him openly and honestly. It is an amazing relationship. And I think Abraham has the kind of relationship with God that most of us would say that we would want. He was even called the friend of God. So the question then becomes, how do we get there? Why aren't more of us friends with God? That's what I want to wrestle with today. And to do so, we're actually going to leave James 2 because Jesus has something to say about all this. And so we want to look at what Jesus says. We'll come back to James 2, but we're going to turn over to John chapter 15. John 15 is where we're going to spend a little time. This is part of a long conversation that Jesus had with his closest disciples during their last night all together before Jesus would then go to the cross and all the events of the Easter weekend that we recognize. And as part of this long kind of final conversation, Jesus actually talks about being a friend of God. So let's look at this. We're going to start in verse 12 in John 15. Jesus says, "This is my commandment. Love each other in the same way I've loved you. There's no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends." And remember, he says this just before he'd go to the cross. And then he says in verse 14, "You are my friends if you do what I command." So let's stop there for a second. I have a son who actually next week is going to turn 3 years old. And we are very much in the phase where playing means doing exactly what he says, exactly the way he says it. If I don't play with Axel exactly the way he wants me to, it's pretty clear that I'm not his friend anymore because I'm not doing exactly what he told me to do, exactly the way he told me. Now, if we stop here at verse 14, that's pretty much what Jesus sounds like. And honestly, I think that's what many in the world around us believe is exactly true about God. You're cool with me if you do exactly what I say. I think many are under the impression that God is either some grumpy old stickler he's very persnickety and things have to be a very particular way, or he's some puppet master who's only happy if you're doing exactly what he wants, exactly the way he wants it, right? Like President Business from the Lego movie, right? Maybe that's your exact impression of God right now. But let's not stop in verse 14. Let's keep reading to see what else we can find. You are my friends if you do what I command. Now verse 15. I no longer call you slaves because a master doesn't confide in his slaves. Now you are my friends since I have told you everything the Father told me. So in just these 2 verses, Jesus has some specific things to say about being his friend. In verse 14, he says, if you do what I command, you are my friend. But in verse 15, Jesus says, since I've told you everything the Father told me, you are my friend. Is this another contradiction? It certainly seems confusing at the least. Well, again, let's take a closer look. Let's slow down. Let's see if we can sort this all out. Let's look at verse 15 first. This is where Jesus says, you are my friend since I've told you everything the Father told me. Well, what does that even mean? I actually like the ESV translation of this verse. I think it better clarifies what he's really saying here. Here's what Jesus says in the ESV. He says, I have called you friends. I have called you friends. For all that I've heard from my Father, I have made known to you. I've made known to you. See, the disciples had been with Jesus for years as he taught and as he did ministry, and he's reminding them that everything he has been doing has been part of revealing God to the world, revealing God's purpose. He's saying, I have made known to you God's master plan. His master plan to rescue you, to set you free from the law, to be in meaningful relationship with him. And he's saying, because I have made this known to you, because I've shown you, I've taught you, I've lived it out, what God is doing, all of that is evidence of what? That I have called you friend. You are my friend since I've made God known to you. There's no exception. There's no exclusivity in this case. He says, you are my friend. This applies to us as well. But verse 14 is different, isn't it? This is where Jesus says, you are my friends if you do what I command. And that if makes a huge difference. That's called a conditional particle, and there's no language barrier on this one. It means exactly what you think. Jesus is putting a contingency clause on the friendship here, if you do what I command. So on the one hand, you have, you are my friends, period, since I did this, you are my friends. And on the other hand, you have, you are my friends if, it depends on what you do. Again, this might sound like a contradiction, but here's what this boils down to. Jesus calls us friend, but we have to say it back. Jesus calls us friend, but we have to say it back. We all know that friendship is a two-way street. There's 2 parties involved. It takes both parties to make a friendship work. And from Jesus' side of the equation, there is no if. He has already done his part. He has called us friend. He has revealed God's plan and purpose. He says, I have already unequivocally proven my friendship. And this is how you say it back. This is how you return the friendship if you follow my commands. Which might lead you to ask, well, what does Jesus command? Somebody else asked that too, and Jesus answered them in Matthew 22. Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind. That's the first and greatest commandment. A second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. You are my friends if you follow my commands. Loving God and loving our neighbors, that's how we say it back. That's how we return the friendship and step into this deeper relationship with God. Jesus calls us friend, and he's waiting to see if we're going to say it back. Now, I always do a little bit better with a visual, so I'm going to come over to my lamp here. Some of you have been desperate to find out why I have the lamp up here. This lamp represents you and me. We're all lamps, okay? Put visual, you are a lamp with me, okay, for just a little bit. We're lamps. This represents us, and this is a normal, average lamp. It's fine, but what is the purpose of a lamp? What is a lamp supposed to do? Yes, make light. It's not a trick question. It's supposed to shine light on the things around it. For the lamp to serve its true purpose, to live out its potential, it needs to be shining light in order to accomplish its goal. If it doesn't shine light, is it still a lamp? Yeah, maybe, probably, kind of, but it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? It's useless for what it's meant. It might even be a dead lamp for all we know. But in order for this lamp to reach its full potential, a few things have to first happen in order for it to shine light. Now, it has to have all the right components and pieces and parts, the things inside that I know they're in there. It's magic to me, but they're in there. I know that. It has to have a light bulb, a working light bulb, right? It has to have all that stuff. But even with all the right pieces and components and parts in place, there still have to be a couple things to happen in order for this to shine, right? The first is that it has to be plugged in. This lamp needs a power source. Whether it's a battery or an outlet, whatever, it doesn't matter. It has to be plugged in to a power source. That has to be true, or this whole thing will not work. And I think in verse 15, Jesus is telling us about the power source to our friendship with God. Jesus has made God known to us. If we are the lamp in this situation, that is how we are plugged in to God. In other places, Jesus says, I'm the way, I'm the truth, I'm the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And just a few verses before this in chapter 15, Jesus calls himself the vine and says that we are meant to be connected to him, to be abiding in him. If we are disconnected from Jesus, we can do nothing. But if we are connected to him, then we're actually connected to God. And that's when incredible things can happen. We are supposed to be plugged in to God. And Jesus, when he says, I have revealed God to you, he is saying, I am the cord to your power source. I am the connection. I came to earth so that you can be plugged in. To be a friend of God, you got to be connected to the power source. So now this lamp has all the right pieces. It has everything it needs. It's connected to a power source. Everything is in place for it to serve its true purpose, to really live out its potential. But what still needs to happen? I got to turn it on. I got to flip the switch. The lamp is not turned on until I flip the switch. And verse 14 is how we flip the switch. You are my friends if you do what I command. Love God and love others. That's how we flip the switch on our friendship with God. That brings us full circle back to James chapter 2. See, James saw people who claimed to be plugged into the power source, claimed to be connected to the ultimate power source of the universe, but he saw no light coming off them. He looked at their lives and he saw no evidence. He's looking at their lives, sees no light to indicate they're connected. So he wrote a letter to tell them, flip the switch. Can't you see that faith without action is useless? What good is it if you say you have faith, but you don't show it? James is begging us to not go around claiming to be plugged into the power source, but having our switch turned off. Not only are we potentially fooling ourselves, but we're confusing the world around us, and we're missing the opportunity to step into friendship with God. We're not meant to simply, escape some sort of cosmic judgment. We were born to be friends of the God of the universe. That's why Jesus came to earth. That's why he laid down his life for us and called us his friends. And again, this should not be bringing shame at all. This should be incredibly exciting. The Bible makes it clear that in Jesus, through no merit of our own, we are already called adopted sons and daughters, co-heirs with Christ, new creations, even saints. And James is saying there's even a way to be a friend of God, to go deeper. But we have to flip the switch. You're in a group and you finally work up the courage to be truly vulnerable and share something you're struggling with. That's flipping the switch. Money's tight. The economy isn't great. You've never given money to a church on a regular basis, but even in the midst of that, you decide out of obedience, I'm going to make giving a priority. That's flipping the switch. You sign up to serve at the banquet. You sign up to mentor in your local school. That's flipping the switch. You ask your neighbor how you can pray for them, and you actually do it. That's flipping the switch. You listen to a devotional in your car on the way to work. That's flipping the switch. The more we flip the switch, the more our friendship with God can grow brighter and brighter. James chapter 2 is telling us, don't be a dead and useless lamp. Flip the switch. Show it. So here's a few questions that are worth wrestling with based on where you are with God today. First and foremost, am I even plugged in? Am I even plugged in? Am I trying to flip a switch through trying my hardest or behavior management or legalism, but I'm not even plugged in to God through faith in Jesus and this free gift of grace? Am I even plugged in to the grace of Jesus Christ? If I am plugged in, is my switch on? Have I flipped the switch on my life? How can I keep flipping the switch on my friendship with God? And how can I let that friendship keep growing brighter and brighter and brighter? God, we have no desire to move into a place where we are all of a sudden taking credit for the things that you have given us. But we also don't want to be dead and useless. God, we're so thankful for the unbelievable gift of grace that you provided through your Son. The free gift that we did not earn. God, thank you for allowing us to step into relationship with you, and thank you for going first. And God, remind us that even though that love can never be earned, it should grow a deep desire within us. And as that desire grows and grows, it should flow through every inch of our being. So God, let our actions, let our words, let our decisions be the outflow of that inner desire to love you with everything that we are, to love our neighbor as ourselves, to let our actions show who you are to us. God, we don't take credit for any of it, but we also want to take responsibility for what you've called us to do. Help us to step into friendship with you. Guide us in what that looks like. Give us the small things that we can do right here and now to flip the switch on our friendship with you. And as we grow in our friendship, we pray that it's to your glory and for the good of the world around us. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.